Chapter 1. The Lyre's Lure. The late afternoon sun cast golden streaks through the ivy-clad windows of St. Mary's Hollow's village hall, bathing the polished oak floor in a warm glow. The air buzzed with anticipation, scented with lavender and the faint polish of old wood. Villagers bustled about, arranging chairs and whispering excitedly about the evening's recital, the first in a decade to feature the legendary Marple Lyre. Miss Evelyn Marple, a sprightly woman in her late 60s with silver hair pinned neatly under a lavender shawl, stood near the stage, her sharp grey eyes scanning the room. To the untrained observer, she was merely the event's host, but to those who knew her, she was the village's keenest mind, a sleuth whose quiet demeanour hid a relentless curiosity. The lyre itself rested on a velvet-draped pedestal at the stage's centre, its golden strings glinting like threads of sunlight. Carved with intricate vines and roses, it looked more like a relic from a fairy tale than a musical instrument. Rumours swirled about its origins. Some said it was crafted by a 17th-century sorcerer, others that its melodies could stir the soul to truth or madness. Miss Marple, ever practical, dismissed such tales, yet even she felt a shiver when her fingers brushed its frame. "A beautiful thing," she murmured to herself, "but beauty often hides a secret." The hall filled steadily. There was Clara, Henshaw, the village baker, her apron swapped for a floral dress, whispering to her husband Thomas, whose furrowed brow suggested a man with more on his mind than music. Across the room, Dr. Langley, the local physician, adjusted his spectacles, his gaze lingering on the lyre with an intensity that piqued Miss Marple's interest. Violet Crane, the young seamstress with a penchant for gossip, flitted between groups, her laughter sharp as a needle. And then there was Colonel Baxter, retired and perpetually gruff, who stood by the door, his cane tapping impatiently as he muttered about frivolous gatherings. "Miss Marple, will you play it yourself?" Violet asked, sidling up with a sly smile. Her eyes sparkled with curiosity, though Miss Marple noted the way they darted toward the Colonel. "Oh, my playing days are long past," Miss Marple replied, her voice light but her gaze steady. "Mr. Grayson, our guest musician, will do the honours. A fine talent, they say." Violet's smile faltered. "Mr. Grayson? The one from London? I heard he's peculiar." "Peculiarity is no crime, my dear," Miss Marple said, patting Violet's arm. "But do tell me, what have you heard?" Before Violet could answer, a hush fell over the room. Mr. Grayson, a wiry man with a shock of dark hair and a velvet coat, stepped onto the stage. His fingers hovered over the lyre, and the crowd leaned forward, breathless. Miss Marple settled into a chair near the back, her knitting needles clicking softly, a habit that helped her think. She watched Grayson's hands, the lyre's strings, and the faces in the crowd filing away every glance, every fidget. The first note rang out, pure and haunting, like a sigh from another world. The melody wove through the hall, stirring sighs and shivers. Clara clutched Thomas's hand. Dr. Langley's lips twitched into a faint smile. Colonel Baxter's cane stilled. Miss Marple's needles paused. There was something in the music, a pull she couldn't name, like a thread tugging at a hidden stitch. As the final chord approached, Grayson's fingers danced faster, the lyre's song swelling to a crescendo. The crowd held its breath. Then, with a single resonant pluck, the final note sang out, and a sharp crack split the air. A gasp rose as a heavy chandelier plummeted from the ceiling, crashing onto the front row where Colonel Baxter had stood moments before. Dust billowed, and screams erupted. Miss Marple was on her feet, her knitting abandoned. The Colonel, pale but unharmed, had stepped aside just in time. But another figure lay motionless beneath the wreckage, Mr. Grayson, the lyre still clutched in his lifeless hands, a single string snapped and curling like a question mark. "Dear me," Miss Marple whispered, her eyes narrowing. "It seems the lyre has played a most dangerous tune." Chapter 2. A note of discord. The village hall, moments ago alive with music, now thrummed with chaos. Villagers huddled in clusters, their whispers sharp as the shattered glass littering the floor. The chandelier's wreckage sprawled across the front row, a twisted cage of iron and crystal, with poor Mr. Grayson's body half buried beneath. The lyre, miraculously untouched, stood on its pedestal, its broken string glinting in the flickering light. Miss Evelyn Marple stood near the stage, her lavender shawl slightly askew, her grey eyes darting from face to face. To the untrained eye, she might have seemed shaken, but her mind was aloom, weaving threads of suspicion. Constable Harrow, a stout man with a moustache that seemed to bristle with indignation, barked orders to clear the hall. "No one leaves until I say," he bellowed, though his voice wavered as he glanced at the lyre. Miss Marple noted his unease, superstition perhaps, or something deeper. "An accident, surely," Clara Henshaw murmured, clutching her husband Thomas's arm. Her round face was pale, but her eyes flickered toward the Colonel, who stood rigid by the door, his cane gripped like a weapon. "Accident!" Violet Crane's voice cut through high and brittle. She stood near Dr. Langley, her fingers twisting a lace handkerchief. "That chandelier didn't fall on its own. Someone tampered with it, I'd wager." "Wager less, Miss Crane," Dr. Langley said coolly, adjusting his spectacles. "Panic breeds nonsense. We need facts, not theatrics." Yet Miss Marple caught the way his hand trembled, just for a moment, as he glanced at the lyre. "Facts, indeed," Miss Marple said softly, stepping forward. Her voice, calm and measured, drew every eye. "Constable, might I suggest securing the lyre? It seems central to this tragedy." Harrow blinked, then nodded. "Right, yes. Evidence." He motioned to a young officer who hesitated before gingerly lifting the lyre and placing it in a wooden case. Miss Marple watched closely, noting the officer's reluctance and the way Violet's gaze followed the instrument. Her lips pursed. As the crowd was herded outside, Miss Marple lingered, her knitting bag slung over her arm. She approached the wreckage, her eyes tracing the chandelier's chain, now a severed coil of iron links. "Curious," she murmured, crouching to inspect a link. It wasn't broken. It was cut, the edges too clean for chance. She slipped a small magnifying glass from her bag, a tool she always carried, and confirmed her suspicion. The cut was fresh. "Deliberate. Miss Marple, you'll catch your death in this dust," Colonel Baxter's gruff voice interrupted. He loomed behind her, his face a mask of irritation, though his eyes betrayed a flicker of fear. "Leave this to the police." "Oh, I shan't interfere," she replied, rising with a disarming smile. "But tell me, Colonel, why did you move from your seat just before the chandelier fell? A fortunate instinct, wasn't it?" Baxter's jaw tightened. "Instinct, yes. Or luck. I felt a draft, stepped aside to close the door. Nothing more. Luck is a fine thing," Miss Marple said, her tone light but her gaze piercing. "Though I wonder if Mr. Grayson was quite so fortunate." Before Baxter could reply, Clara's voice rang out from the doorway. Miss Marple, they're saying the Lyre's cursed, that it chose Grayson." Her hands fluttered, and Thomas beside her looked grim, his eyes fixed on the floor. "Cursed? Nonsense," Dr. Langley scoffed, joining them. "The Lyre's a relic, not a demon, though I'll admit its history is unsettling." "History?" Miss Marple tilted her head, her needles clicking softly as she retrieved her knitting from her bag. "Do enlighten us, Doctor." Langley hesitated, then lowered his voice. "It belonged to a musician decades ago who died under questionable circumstances. Some say the Lyre's strings were rigged to harm. Superstition, of course." "Of course," Miss Marple echoed, though her mind catalogued the detail. She glanced at Violet, who hovered nearby, her face a mix of fear and fascination. "Violet, dear, you mentioned Mr. Grayson was peculiar. Care to elaborate?" Violet flushed, glancing at the others. "Well, he asked odd questions when he arrived. About the Lyre, its owners who'd be at the recital. Like he was looking for someone, Miss Marple repeated, her needles pausing. "And now he's dead. How very intriguing." As Constable Harrow called for witnesses to gather outside, Miss Marple stepped into the cool evening air, her mind racing. The cut chain, the Lyre's history, Grayson's questions, Baxter's timely dodge. Each was a note in a discordant melody. And somewhere, she knew, a killer was listening, waiting for the next chord to strike. Chapter 3. The Fatal Chord. The night air outside St. Mary's Hollow's village hall was crisp, laced with the scent of damp grass and the faint tang of fear. Villagers clustered under the glow of gas lamps, their faces a gallery of shock, suspicion, and barely concealed guilt. Constable Harrow paced before them, scribbling names in a battered notebook, his moustache twitching with every muttered curse. Miss Evelyn Marple stood slightly apart, her lavender shawl drawn tight, her knitting needles idle in her hands. Her eyes, however, were anything but idle, flitting from one villager to the next, catching the subtle tells of a village unravelling. Mr. Grayson's body had been covered with a tarp, but the image of his lifeless form, the lyre clutched in his hands, lingered in every mind. The snapped string, curling like a sinister smile, haunted Miss Marple most of all. She'd seen the cut chandelier chain, deliberate, precise. This was no accident, and the lyre was no mere prop. It was the heart of the crime, and she intended to pluck its secrets. "Miss Marple, you shouldn't be out here catching a chill," Clara Henshaw said, approaching with a nervous smile. Her hands twisted her shawl, and her eyes darted toward her husband Thomas, who stood silent, staring at the hall's shattered windows. "It's dreadful, isn't it? Poor Mr. Grayson." "Dreadful, yes," Miss Marple agreed, her voice gentle, but her gaze sharp. "Though I wonder, Clara, why Mr. Grayson was chosen. Did you speak with him before the recital?" Clara flushed, her fingers stilling. "Me? Oh, barely. He bought a loaf from the bakery yesterday, asked about the village. Polite, but distant." "Distant," Miss Marple echoed, filing the word away. "And you, Thomas? Did you find him distant?" Thomas started, his broad shoulders tensing. "Didn't know the man," he said gruffly. "He came, he played, he died. That's all I know." His eyes met hers for a moment, then slid away, dark with something unspoken. Before Miss Marple could press further, Violet Crane's voice pierced the murmurs. "Constable, you must check the lyre. It's cursed, I tell you." She stood near Dr. Langley, her face pale, her lace handkerchief shredded in her hands. Grayson knew something about it, and now he's dead. Enough of that nonsense, Colonel Baxter snapped, limping forward. His cane struck the ground with a sharp thwack. Curses don't cut chains. Someone in this village is a murderer, and I'd wager they're standing among us. The crowd stilled, eyes darting to neighbours, friends, enemies. Dr. Langley cleared, his throat, his voice calm but strained. Colonel, let's not jump to conclusions. The chandelier could have been faulty. Old buildings, you know. Faulty? Baxter scoffed. You saw that chain, Langley, clean as a whistle. Someone meant to kill. Miss Marple's needles resumed their soft clicking, a rhythm that steadied her thoughts. Colonel, you were nearly under that chandelier yourself, she said, her tone mild. Had you not moved, we might be mourning two losses. Who knew you'd be seated there? Baxter's face reddened. What are you implying, woman? I didn't rig the blasted thing. I told you, I felt a draught, stepped to the door. Pure chance. Chance? Miss Marple murmured, her eyes lingering on his cane, its tip worn but sturdy. She turned to Constable Harrow, who was struggling to calm the crowd. Constable, might I examine the Lyre's case? Just a glance to set my mind at ease. Harrow frowned, then sighed. If it'll keep you from meddling, fine. But don't touch anything. He led her to a corner where the Lyre rested in its wooden case, guarded by the young officer from earlier. The officer stepped aside, his face pale, as if the Lyre might spring to life. Miss Marple peered through the cases. Glass lid, her magnifying glass in hand. The snapped string caught her eye, but so did something else. A faint scratch on the Lyre's frame, near the tuning pegs, as if someone had tampered with its mechanism. Curious, she said softly. This scratch is fresh, Constable. And the string, it didn't break from overuse. It was cut just like the chain. Harrow's eyes widened. Cut? You're sure? As sure as I am of my own name, she replied, straightening. Someone ensured the Lyre's final chord would be deadly. But why Mr. Grayson? Or was it you, Colonel, they meant to strike? Question hung in the air, unanswered, as a sudden scream shattered the night. Violet Crane pointed toward the hall, her face ashen. The Lyre, it's playing. From within the hall, a single eerie note drifted out, low and mournful, as if the Lyre had stirred of its own accord. The crowd froze, and even Miss Marple felt a prickle of unease. But her mind was clear. A killer was orchestrating this symphony of fear, and she would not let them play another note unchallenged. Chapter 4. Strings of Suspicion. The mournful note from the Lyre lingered in the night air, a ghostly echo that sent shivers through the crowd outside St. Mary's Hollow's village. Hall. Villagers pressed closer together, their whispers a mix of fear and accusation. Constable Harrow, his face flushed with exasperation, stormed toward the hall's entrance, barking at his young officer to secure that blasted instrument. Miss Evelyn Marple remained still, her lavender shawl catching the lamplight, her knitting needles silent in her bag. The Lyre's note wasn't supernatural, she was certain of that, but it was a deliberate taunt, and she meant to unravel its purpose. Inside the hall, the Lyre sat undisturbed in its glass-topped case, its strings motionless. Harrow glared at it, then at the officer, who stammered, I swear, sir, no one touched it. I was right here. Miss Marple, following quietly, noted the officer's trembling hands and the faint scuff marks on the floor near the case. Someone had been here, she thought, and not long ago. Miss Marple, this is no place for you, Harrow said, though his tone lacked conviction. He wiped sweat from his brow, his eyes darting to the Lyre. "Oh, I shan't interfere," she replied, her voice as mild as chamomile tea. "But might I suggest checking the case's lock? If the lyre played, someone opened it or rigged it to play." Harrow grunted, inspecting the lock. His frown deepened. "It's intact. No sign of tampering." But Miss Marple's magnifying glass revealed a faint smudge on the glass. A fingerprint, perhaps, or the trace of a glove. She said nothing, storing the detail for later. Outside, the villagers had dispersed into smaller groups, their voices low but tense. Miss Marple rejoined them, her eyes scanning for tells. Clara Henshaw clung to Thomas, her face buried in his shoulder. But Thomas's gaze was fixed on Dr. Langley, who stood apart, scribbling in a small notebook. Violet Crane hovered near Colonel Baxter, her nervous chatter filling the silence. "It's the curse, Colonel. I know it. The liars. Punishing us." "Poppycock!" Baxter snapped, his cane striking the ground. "Someone's playing tricks, and I'll have their hide for it." Yet his eyes flicked toward the hall, betraying a crack in his bluster. Miss Marple approached Violet, her smile disarming. "Violet, dear, you seem quite convinced of this curse. Did Mr. Grayson mention anything about the liar's history when he spoke to you?" Violet's hands froze, mid-twist of her tattered handkerchief. He only said it was valuable. Asked if anyone in the village had tried to buy it. I thought he was just curious." "Curious," Miss Marple mused, her needles clicking softly as she retrieved her knitting. "And who might have wanted it? The liar's been in my family for years, but I've had offers." Violet hesitated, then lowered her voice. "Well, Dr. Langley once asked me about it when I was mending his coat. Said he'd pay a fortune for a relic like that. And Thomas, Mr. Henshaw, mentioned it, too, at the bakery. Said it could fetch enough to save their shop." Miss Marple's needles paused. "Did he now?" She glanced at Thomas, whose jaw tightened as if he sensed her scrutiny. The Henshaw's bakery had been struggling. She'd seen the ledgers, left open once on their counter. Desperation could tune a man's heart to dangerous notes. Dr. Langley approached, pocketing his notebook. "Miss Marple, I hope you're not encouraging this curse nonsense. The liar's a mechanical marvel, nothing more. Grayson's death was a tragic sabotage, not magic." "Sabotage, yes," Miss Marple agreed, her tone light. "But why Grayson? You knew him, didn't you, Doctor? He visited your practice last week, I believe." Langley's spectacles slipped slightly, and he pushed them up with a forced smile. "A routine checkup. The man was healthy, if a bit intense. He asked about the liar's previous owners, but I told him little. History isn't my field." "Yet you know it's history," Miss Marple said, her eyes twinkling. "Enough to call it unsettling." Langley's smile faltered, but before he could reply, Constable Harrow emerged from the hall, his face grim. "Miss Marple, you were right about the string. It was cut, clean through, and we found this." He held up a small folded paper, tucked inside the liar's case. He unfolded it, revealing a single line in spidery script. "The liar sings for those who sin." A gasp rippled through the crowd. Clara clutched Thomas's arm. Violet's handkerchief tore in two, and Baxter's cane trembled. Langley's face was unreadable, but his fingers twitched. Miss Marple's mind raced. The note was a flourish, a killer's attempt to stoke fear, or to misdirect. But it confirmed one thing. Grayson's death was personal, tied to the liar's past or the sins of St. Mary's Hollow. As Harrow ordered the villagers to disperse, promising interviews tomorrow, Miss Marple lingered, her gaze on the hall. They did. Lyre's secrets were tightening like strings, and she sensed the killer was tuning up for another deadly performance. She needed to act before the next chord struck. Chapter 5. Melodies of the Past. The village of St. Mary's Hollow lay quiet, under a shroud of mist, the gas lamps casting hazy halos along the cobbled lanes. Inside Miss Evelyn Marple's modest cottage, a fire crackled in the hearth, its warmth battling the chill that clung to her bones. She sat at her oak table, a cup of chamomile tea steaming beside her knitting, her grey eyes fixed on an old leather-bound journal. The cryptic note from the Lyre's case, "The lyre sings for those who sin," lay unfolded before her, its spidery script taunting her. The Lyre's eerie note from the hall still echoed in her mind. But Miss Marple was no fool for superstition. Someone had orchestrated this fear, and the key lay in the Lyre's past. She opened the journal, its pages yellowed and brittle, a record kept by her great-aunt, Beatrice Marple, the Lyre's first owner in the family. The entries spoke of the Lyre's arrival in 1847, a gift from a travelling musician named Elias Varnholt, whose performances in St. Mary's Hollow had mesmerised the village. But Beatrice's words grew darker with each page. Elias played melodies that stirred the heart to truth or torment, she wrote. After his final recital, he vanished, and a merchant was found dead, his throat cut, a lyre string wound tight around his neck. Miss Marple's needles, resting idle, twitched in her fingers. A memory stirred, a village tale of Elias's lyre, rumoured to be rigged with hidden mechanisms, its strings tuned not just for music, but for mischief. She closed the journal, her mind drifting to a vision of that long-ago night. Flashback. St. Mary's Hollow, 1847. The village hall glowed with candlelight, packed with villagers in their Sunday best. Elias Varnholt, a lean man with eyes like polished obsidian, stood on the stage, the lyre cradled in his hands. Its strings shimmered as he plucked them, weaving a melody that seemed to pull at the soul. In the front row, a merchant named Gideon Holt sat rigid, his face pale, his hands gripping. His cane, whispers rippled through the crowd. Gideon had cheated Elias in a deal, pocketing gold meant for the musician's troupe. As the final chord rang out, a sharp snap echoed. Gideon gasped, clutching his chest, and collapsed. The crowd surged forward, but Elias was already gone. The lyre left on its pedestal. Later, the coroner found a thin wire embedded in Gideon's coat, laced with poison, triggered by the lyre's vibration. The village called it a curse, but Beatrice, watching from the back, saw the truth. Elias had tuned the lyre to kill. Back in her cottage, Miss Marple blinked, the fire's crackle pulling her to the present. The parallels were uncanny. Grayson's death, the cut string, the chandelier's fall. Someone had studied the lyre's history, recreating Elias's deadly art. But who? And why Grayson, a stranger whose questions about the lyre had stirred unease? A knock at the door startled her. Constable Harrow stood on the threshold, his moustache drooping with fatigue. "Miss Marple, I shouldn't be here, but we found something in Grayson's lodgings. Thought you'd want to know." He handed her a folded letter, its wax seal broken. Inside, in Grayson's precise hand, were notes. Lyre's mechanism, springs in base, possible trigger. Langley knows more than he says. Henshaw's in debt. Baxter's cane suspicious. Miss Marple's lips twitched into a faint smile. Grayson had been a sleuth in his own right, and his death suggested he'd struck a nerve. "Langley, you say?" She mused, her eyes meeting Harrow's. And what of the Henshaws? Clara seemed fond of Grayson, yet Thomas was guarded. Harrow shifted uncomfortably. Thomas owes half the village money. Bakery's on its last legs. And Langley, well, he's been poking around the Lyre for years. Says it's a scientific curiosity. And Colonel Baxter. Miss Marple pressed, recalling the cane's sturdy tip, perfect for prying or striking. Claims he's just a grumpy old man, Harrow said. But he was at that recital in 47 as a boy. His father knew Elias. Miss Marple's needles resumed their soft clicking. Did he now? How very interesting. She folded the letter, her mind weaving new threads. Grayson's notes pointed to multiple suspects, each with a motive tied to the Lyre. Debt, obsession, or a buried grudge. But the note in the Lyre's case suggested a deeper sin, one rooted in the village's past. As Harrow left, promising to keep the Lyre under lock and key, Miss Marple returned to the journal. A final entry caught her eye. The Lyre's strings hold secrets, but its base hides the truth. I sealed it, lest it sing again. She frowned, her fingers tracing the words. The Lyre's base. Grayson had mentioned springs. Had someone unsealed its mechanism, turning it into a weapon once more? Outside the mist thickened, muffling the village's heartbeat. Miss Marple sipped her tea, her gaze distant. The Lyre's melody was far from over, and she sensed the killer was watching, waiting for her to miss a note. But she was ready to play their game and win. Chapter 6. The village unravels. The morning sun struggled through the mist, cloaking St. Mary's Hollow, casting a pale glow over the village square. Villagers gathered outside the constable's office, their faces drawn, their whispers a low hum of dread. The Lyre's deadly performance, and the cryptic note, "The Lyre sings for those who sin," had frayed the village's nerves, and Grayson's death felt like the first note of a darker symphony. Miss Evelyn Marple stood near the office's stone steps, her lavender shawl neatly pinned, her knitting bag slung over her arm. Her grey eyes, sharp as a hawk's, scanned the crowd, catching flickers of guilt and fear. Inside, Constable Harrow had set up a makeshift interrogation room, its walls lined with faded maps and a single oil lamp flickering on the table. Miss Marple, granted permission to observe as a courtesy, sat in a corner, her needles clicking softly, a rhythm that masked her relentless focus. She clutched Grayson's letter, found in his lodgings, its words etched in her mind. Langley's knowledge, the Henshaw's debts, Baxter's suspicious cane. Each suspect was a string, and she was determined to find which one was out of tune. First came Dr. Langley, his spectacles gleaming as he settled into the chair. Harrow leaned forward, his moustache twitching. "You knew Grayson, Doctor. He visited your practice. What did he want?" Langley's fingers tapped the table, a nervous staccato. "A checkup, as I told Miss Marple. He was healthy, if overly curious about the Lyre. Asked if I'd studied its mechanisms. I hadn't." Miss Marple's needles paused. "Yet you called it a scientific curiosity, Doctor, and Grayson's notes suggest you know more about its history than you've shared." Langley's smile was thin. "History, not mechanics. I read about Elias Farnholt, the Lyre's first owner. A charlatan, nothing more. Grayson was chasing ghosts." "Ghosts that got him killed," Harrow muttered, scribbling in his notebook. "Where were you when the chandelier fell?" "In my seat, third row," Langley said smoothly. "I saw nothing but the Lyre's strings and Grayson's hands." Miss Marple noted the precision of his answer. Too precise, perhaps. As Langley left, she caught a glint in his eyes, like a man guarding a secret. Next were the Henshaws. Clara entered clutching Thomas's arm, her eyes red-rimmed. Thomas's face was a storm cloud, his broad hands clenched. Harrow wasted no time. "Thomas, your bakery's drowning in debt. Grayson asked about the Lyre's value. Did you think selling it could save you?" Thomas's jaw tightened. "I hear—" "Didn't kill him. I barely spoke to the man. Yes, we're struggling. Who isn't? But I'm no murderer." Clara's voice trembled. "He's telling the truth. Grayson was kind, bought bread, asked about the village. He seemed worried, like someone was watching him." "Watching him?" Miss Marple's voice was soft, but it cut through the room. "Did he say who, Clara?" Clara hesitated, glancing at Thomas. "No, but he looked at Colonel Baxter once, when we passed him in the square, like he recognized him." Thomas shot her a look, and Miss Marple's needles resumed their click. A thread was forming. Grayson's fear, Baxter's, passed. She recalled the journal entry about Elias Varnholt and Baxter's father, a witness to that deadly recital in 1847. Colonel Baxter was last, limping in with his cane, his face a mask of indignation. "This is outrageous," he growled. "I'm no killer. I moved from that seat by chance, and I'm alive because of it." Harrow leaned forward. "Grayson's notes mention your cane, Colonel. Said it was suspicious. Care to explain?" Baxter's grip on the cane tightened, its tip glinting in the lamplight. "The man was paranoid. My cane's for walking, not scheming. I barely knew him." "But you knew Elias Varnholt," Miss Marple interjected, her tone mild. "Your father was at his recital, wasn't he? The one where a man died. Did Grayson ask you about it?" Baxter's eyes narrowed, but he recovered quickly. "He asked nonsense about the Lyre, old rumours. I told him to leave the past alone. Clearly, he didn't listen." As Baxter stormed out, Miss Marple exchanged a glance with Harrow. The interrogations had cracked open lies, but the killer's tune was still elusive. She stepped outside, the crowd parting as she approached Violet Crane, who stood alone, her handkerchief in tatters. "Violet, dear," Miss Marple said, her smile warm, but her eyes probing. "You said Grayson was looking for someone. Did he ever mention a name?" Violet's face paled. He asked about a woman, someone who owned the Lyre years ago. Said her name was in a letter he found. I don't remember it, I swear." Miss Marple's needles stilled. A woman, a letter, new notes in the Lyre's melody. Before she could press further, a shout rang out from the constable's office. Harrow burst through the door, his face ashen. "The Lyre's case! It's been opened! And there's another note." He held up a scrap of paper, its script identical to the first. "The Lyre's next chord will strike at dusk." The crowd gasped, and Miss Marple's heart quickened. Dusk was hours away, and the killer was tightening the strings. She glanced at the suspects, Langley's calm facade, Thomas's clenched fists, Baxter's scowl, Violet's trembling hands. One of them was playing a deadly game, and she had to find the right chord before the Lyre sang again. Chapter 7. A Dangerous Refrain. The afternoon sun hung low over St. Mary's Hollow. its light dulled by a gathering haze that mirrored the village's unease. The constable's office buzzed with nervous energy, villagers lingering outside, their eyes darting toward the locked room where the lyre rested. The second note, "The lyre's next chord will strike at dusk," had ignited panic, and whispers of the lyre's curse grew louder. Miss Evelyn Marple stood near the village well, her lavender shawl catching a faint breeze, her knitting needles clicking softly in her hands. Her mind, however, was a storm of connections. Grayson's letter, the lyre's deadly history, the woman Violet mentioned. The killer was tightening their grip, and dusk was less than 2 hours away. Constable Harrow emerged from his office, his face haggard, clutching a telegram. "Miss Marple, we've got Grayson's background," he said, lowering his voice. "He wasn't just a musician. He was a private investigator, hired to trace the lyre's history. Someone paid him to dig into St. Mary's Hollow's past." Miss Marple's needles paused. "Paid him? Did the telegram say who?" Harrow shook his head. "Anonymous client, wired funds through a London bank. But Grayson's notes mentioned a woman, Lillian Varnholt, Elias's sister. She owned the lyre after his disappearance in 47. Lillian Varnholt." The name struck a chord, echoing Violet's vague recollection. Miss Marple recalled her great-aunt's journal, which mentioned a LV who vanished after a scandal. "Curious," she murmured. "Grayson was hunting a ghost, and it cost him his life. But whose sin did he uncover?" Before Harrow could reply, a scream shattered the square. Violet Crane stumbled from the seamstress shop, her face ashen, pointing at a crumpled figure on the cobblestones. "It's Clara! She's hurt!" The crowd surged forward as Miss Marple and Harrow pushed through. Clara Henshaw lay gasping, her floral dress torn, a heavy wooden beam beside her. Thomas knelt at her side, his hands shaking as he cradled her head. "It fell from the shop's awning," he choked out. "She was locking up and it just fell." Dr. Langley, summoned from the crowd, knelt to examine Clara. "She's concussed, but she'll live," he said, his voice steady, but his eyes flicking toward the beam. Miss Marple crouched beside it, her magnifying glass in hand. The beam's support nails were missing, the wood freshly splintered, as if pried loose. "This was no accident," she said softly, her gaze sweeping the crowd. Harrow's moustache twitched. "Another sabotage. But the note said dusk." "The note was a misdirection," Miss Marple replied, rising. "Or a warning. The killer's growing bold, striking in daylight." She glanced at Thomas, whose face was a mask of anguish or guilt. Clara's injury shifted the melody, but to what end? As Langley and Thomas carried Clara to the doctor's clinic, Miss Marple approached Violet, who stood trembling, her handkerchief in shreds. "Violet, dear, you were in the shop with Clara. Did you see anyone near the awning?" Violet's eyes widened. "No, I mean, I was inside sewing, but I heard a creak, like someone was on the roof, and I saw Colonel Baxter pass by earlier, tapping his cane. He looked angry." Miss Marple's needles resumed their click. Baxter again, his cane a recurring note. She recalled Grayson's suspicion of it, sturdy enough to pry nails or cut strings. But Langley's calm efficiency and Thomas's desperation couldn't be ignored. And what of Lillian Varnholt, a shadow from the past? She returned to the constable's office, where Harrow was inspecting the lyre's case. The lock was intact, but Miss Marple noticed a faint scratch near the hinge, similar to the one on the Lyre's frame. "Someone has been at this again," she said, her voice low. "They're planning the next strike." Harrow paled. "At dusk, like the note said." "Perhaps," Miss Marple said, her mind racing. "But Clara's attack suggests they're improvising. We need to watch our suspects closely. Langley, Thomas, Baxter, and Violet too. Her fear feels rehearsed." Harrow nodded, assigning officers to tail the suspects. Miss Marple stepped outside, her gaze settling on the village clock. An hour until dusk. She needed to decode the Lyre's mechanism, the springs Grayson mentioned, before the killer played another deadly chord. But a deeper question gnawed at her. Was Clara the target, or a distraction to lure someone else into the open? As the sun dipped lower, casting long shadows across the square, a faint hum drifted from the constable's office. A single ghostly note from the Lyre. The crowd froze, and Miss Marple's heart quickened. The killer was one step ahead, and the next chord was about to strike. Chapter 8. The Lyre's Secret. The air in St. Mary's Hollow grew heavy as dusk approached. The village square bathed in the bruised purple of twilight. The Lyre's ghostly hum from the constable's office had silenced the crowd, their faces pale with fear, their whispers stilled. The second note, "The Lyre's next chord will strike at dusk," loomed like a guillotine, and the clock towers. Hands ticked closer to the hour. Miss Evelyn Marple stood near the constable's office, her lavender shawl catching the fading light, her knitting needles silent in her bag. Her mind wove threads of evidence. Grayson's investigator role, Lillian, Van Holt's shadow, the sabotaged beam, the Lyre's scratched case. The killer was playing a deadly crescendo, but Miss Marple was ready to strike a counterpoint. Constable Harrow, his face etched with strain, ushered her inside, where the Lyre rested in its glass-topped case, guarded by 2 officers. The faint scratch near the hinge gleamed under the oil lamp's glow, a silent accusation. "We've tripled the lock," Harrow said, his voice low. "No one's getting near it. But that hum, it's unnatural." "Unnatural, perhaps, but not supernatural," Miss Marple replied, her tone calm, but her grey eyes sharp. She recalled her great-aunt's journal. The Lyre's base hides the truth. Grayson's notes had mentioned springs, and the Lyre's frame bore fresh scratches. "Constable, may I examine the Lyre's base?" "With care, of course." Harrow hesitated, then nodded. "Be quick. Dusk is minutes away." He unlocked the case, and Miss Marple, her magnifying glass in hand, leaned over the Lyre. Its golden strings shimmered, but her focus was the carved wooden base, adorned with vines and roses. She pressed gently, feeling for a seam. A soft click sounded, and a small panel slid open, revealing a hidden compartment. Inside lay a coiled spring, a tiny lever, and a thin wire, rigged to vibrate a string when triggered. "Dear me," Miss Marple murmured, her heart quickening. "This is no mere instrument. It's a machine, built for mischief." The spring matched Elias Van Holt's deadly design from 1847, and someone had reactivated it. But how had it hummed without touch? Harrow's eyes widened. A trap, like the chandelier. "Precisely," she said, closing the panel. The hum was a test, likely triggered remotely. A weight, perhaps, or a timed mechanism. The killer's taunting us, ensuring we fear the liar's next note. Before Harrow could respond, a shout echoed outside. "The clock tower! Something's moving!" Miss Marple and Harrow rushed to the square, where villagers pointed skyward. A shadow flitted near the clock tower's face, a figure cloaked in dark cloth, tampering with the bell rope. The clock struck dusk, and a single resonant dong rang out, followed by a sickening snap. A heavy bell clapper plummeted from the tower, crashing into the square inches from Dr. Langley, who staggered back, his spectacles askew. Chaos erupted. Villagers screamed, scattering, as Harrow's officers raced to the tower. Miss Marple's gaze locked on Langley, his face pale but composed, and then on the crowd. Thomas Henshaw, gripping Clara's hand as she leaned on him, still dazed from her earlier injury. Colonel Baxter, his cane planted firmly, his eyes narrowed. Violet Crane, sobbing into her tattered handkerchief. One of them had rigged the clapper, just as they'd cut the chandelier chain and the Lyre's string. "Constable, secure the tower," Miss Marple said, her voice steady, "and check the rope for tampering. This was no accident." As Harrow barked orders, she approached Langley, her smile disarming. "Doctor, you've had a narrow escape, the second in 2 days, if we count the chandelier. Fortunate, wouldn't you say?" Langley adjusted his spectacles, his voice clipped. "Fortune or fate, Miss Marple? I was merely passing by. Surely you don't think I'm the target?" "Litten or bait," she replied, her eyes twinkling. "Someone's playing a dangerous game, and you're in the melody. Grayson suspected you knew the Lyre's secrets. Care to share?" Langley's jaw tightened. "I told you, I know its history, not its mechanics. Grayson was obsessed, chasing rumours of Lillian Varnholt. He thought she hid something in the Lyre." "Lillian," Miss Marple echoed, her needles resuming their soft click as she retrieved her knitting. "And did he find it?" Langley hesitated, then shook his head. "If he did, he didn't tell me." But his fingers twitched, and Miss Marple noted the lie. As the crowd dispersed, Harrow returned, holding a severed rope from the tower. "Cut clean, like the chain," he said grimly, "and we found this tied to it." He held up a tiny brass key etched with a rose, the same design as the Lyre's carvings. Miss Marple's breath caught. The key was a message, a link to the Lyre's hidden compartment. She glanced at the suspects, her mind racing. The killer had miscalculated, striking too soon, revealing their hand. But the Lyre's final chord was yet to play, and she needed to decode the key's purpose before it sang again. Chapter 9. The Final Performance. The twilight over St. Mary's Hollow deepened into a velvet darkness, broken only by the flickering gas lamps lining the village square. The air crackled with tension, the memory of the falling bell clapper still fresh, its near miss on Dr. Langley a stark warning. The brass key, etched with a rose and found tied to the sabotage tower rope, lay heavy in Miss Evelyn Marple's pocket, its purpose a tantalizing mystery. She stood outside the village hall, her lavender shawl catching the lamplight, her knitting bag at her side. Her grey eyes gleamed with purpose. The Lyre's final chord was near, and she would orchestrate its unmasking. Inside the hall, Constable Harrow had gathered the suspects: Dr. Langley, Thomas, and Clara Henshaw, Colonel Baxter, and Violet Crane, under the pretence of a final evidence review. The lyre, secured in its glass case, stood on the stage, its golden strings glinting like a predator's eyes. Miss Marple had insisted on this setting, a deliberate echo of Grayson's fatal recital. "The killer thrives on theatrics," she'd told Harrow. "Let's give them a stage." Harrow paced before the group, his moustache bristling. "We're here to settle this," he said, his voice firm. "The lyre's mechanism, the cut strings, the notes, it's all deliberate. One of you knows more than you're saying." Langley adjusted his spectacles, his face calm, but his fingers twitching. "I've said all I know, Constable. Grayson was chasing myths about Lillian Varnholt. I had no reason to harm him." Thomas, supporting Clara, who leaned heavily on his arm, glared at Langley. "Myths? Someone tried to kill my wife today. If it's not you, who?" Clara, still pale from her concussion, nodded weakly, her eyes darting to Violet. Violet clutched her tattered handkerchief, her voice shrill. "Don't look at me. I'm no killer. Grayson was asking about the lyre, yes, but I told him nothing." Her gaze flicked to the lyre, fear or guilt etched in her features. Colonel Baxter slammed his cane on the floor. "Enough whining! The lyre's a tool, not a curse. Someone here cut that chain, rigged that clapper. I say it's Langley. Too calm, too clever." Miss Marple, seated near the stage, let her needles click softly, drawing every eye. "A tool indeed, Colonel," she said, her tone mild, "but a clever one. The lyre's base hides a mechanism, springs and wires, tuned to kill. Grayson found it, and it cost him his life. The question is, who else knew?" She rose, approaching the lyre's case, the brass key in her hand. The crowd tensed as she inserted it into a hidden slot beneath the case's hinge, revealed by her earlier inspection. A soft click echoed, and the case's base opened, exposing a second compartment. Inside lay a folded parchment, yellowed with age, bearing the initials LV. "Lillian Varnholt," Miss Marple said, unfolding it. The parchment listed names, village families from 1847, including Baxter's father and a merchant, Gideon Holt, killed by Elias's lyre. "This is a ledger of debts, marked by Lillian after her brother's disappearance. Someone in this room is tied to those debts, and Grayson's investigation threatened to expose them." Langley's face paled, Thomas's fists clenched, Baxter's cane trembled. Violet's sob broke the silence. Miss Marple's eyes scanned them, her trap set. "Constable, let's reenact the recital. Play the lyre's strings, carefully. The killer won't resist tampering again." Harrow hesitated, then nodded, assigning an officer to pluck the strings. The crowd held its breath as the first note rang out, pure and haunting. Miss Marple watched the suspects, her magnifying glass hidden in her palm. Langley's fingers twitched toward his pocket. Thomas shifted closer to Clara. Baxter's cane tapped once, then stilled. Violet's eyes locked on the lyre, her hands shaking. On the third note, a faint snap sounded, not from the lyre, but from the stage's rigging. A sandbag plummeted, aimed at the officer, but Miss Marple's shout, "Now!" sent Harrow's men springing forward. They seized Violet, who screamed, a small knife slipping from her handkerchief. A wire, tied to the rigging, led to a pulley. She'd rigged during the chaos of the clapper's fall. "Violet Crane," Miss Marple said, her voice steady. "You knew the lyre's mechanism, learned from Grayson's questions. You cut the string, the chain, the rope. But why? Violet's face crumpled, her sobs turning to venom. Grayson was digging up my family's shame. My great-aunt was Lillian Varnholt. She hid the Lyre's secrets to protect us, but Grayson found her ledger. He'd ruin us, the crowd gasped. Harrow cuffed Violet, but Miss Marple's gaze lingered on the Lyre. Violet's confession explained the murders, but the ledger's names, Baxter, Holt, others, hinted at a deeper truth. One Grayson had died to uncover. The Lyre's final chord was yet to play, and she sensed its melody would rewrite the village's past. Chapter 10. The unstrung truth. The village hall of St. Mary's Hollow was silent, the air thick with the aftermath of Violet Crane's unmasking. Her confession, driven by fear of Grayson exposing her family's connection to Lillian Varnholt, had stunned the villagers. But Miss Evelyn Marple's grey eyes remained restless. Violet's knife, the rigged sandbag, the cut strings, all pointed to her guilt, yet the ledger's list of names, etched with debts from 1847, whispered of a deeper sin. The Lyre, still on its pedestal, seemed to watch, its golden strings unstrung, but not silent. Miss Marple's lavender shawl caught the lamplight as she stepped forward, her knitting bag at her side, ready to pluck the final chord. Constable Harrow, cuffing Violet, looked to Miss Marple with a mix of relief and unease. "You've done it, Miss Marple. Violet's our killer. But that ledger, what's it mean?" "A question worth asking," she replied, her voice calm but her mind racing. She held the parchment from the Lyre's hidden compartment, its faded, ink-listing families, Baxter, Holt, and others, tied to Elias Varnholt's era. Violet acted to protect her family's name, but Grayson's investigation stirred a larger secret, one someone else wanted buried. The suspects, Dr. Langley, Thomas and Clara Henshaw, Colonel Baxter, stood frozen, their faces a gallery of shock and suspicion. Clara, leaning on Thomas, whispered, "It's over, isn't it?" But Thomas's eyes flicked to Baxter, a shadow crossing his face. Miss Marple turned to the Lyre, her fingers tracing its carved roses. "This instrument has played many tunes," she said, addressing the room. "In 1847, Elias Varnholt used it to kill Gideon Holt, a merchant who cheated him. Lillian, his sister, hid the Lyre and its ledger, documenting debts owed to her brother. Grayson, hired to trace that history, found the ledger's trail. But why kill him? Violet feared scandal, but there's more." She faced Colonel Baxter, whose cane tapped once, sharply. "Colonel, your father was named in this ledger. He owed Elias money, didn't he? And you were at that recital as a boy, watching Gideon die." Baxter's face reddened. "What are you implying? My father paid his debts. I had nothing to do with Grayson." "Perhaps," Miss Marple said, her eyes twinkling. "But someone else did. Someone who knew the Lyre's mechanism and Lillian's secrets." She turned to Dr. Langley, whose spectacles glinted as he shifted uncomfortably. "Doctor, you dismissed the Lyre's curse, yet you studied its history. Grayson suspected you. Why?" Langley's voice was tight. "I told you he was obsessed. I knew nothing of his death." Miss Marple's needles clicked softly as she retrieved her knitting. "Yet you lied about Lillian. You said she hid something in the Lyre, but you didn't mention your own connection. Your grandfather, a village clerk, was also in the ledger. He helped Lillian disappear after Elias's crime, didn't he? For a price? The room stilled. Langley's face paled, his hands trembling. That's preposterous. Is it? Miss Marple held up the brass key, its rose etching catching the light. This key unlocked the Lyre's compartment, but it also fits a lockbox in your study, Doctor. I checked with Constable Harrow this morning. Inside, we found letters, Lillian's detailing a pact. Your grandfather covered up a murder, not Gideon's but another, committed by Lillian herself. She killed a rival who threatened to expose Elias's rigged lyre. Your family's wealth came from that silence. Harrow gasped. Langley? You're behind this? Langley's composure cracked, his voice rising. Grayson was going to ruin me. He found Lillian's letters, traced them to me. I told Violet to scare him, to cut the string, but she went too far. I never meant for murder. Violet's scream cut through. You liar! You showed me how to rig the lyre, said it'd protect us both. The crowd erupted, and Harrow's officers seized Langley, who slumped, defeated. Miss Marple's gaze softened, but her mind lingered on the ledger. The lyre sang for those who sinned, she said quietly. Lillian's crime, your grandfather's silence, Violet's fear, Langley's greed, all tied to 1847. Grayson's death was the final note of a long-buried tune. As the suspects were led away, Clara approached, her voice trembling. Miss Marple, will the village ever heal? Miss Marple smiled, patting her arm. In time, dear. Truth, like a good stitch, holds strong. But as she glanced at the lyre, a final twist unravelled in her mind. The ledger's last name wasn't Baxter or Langley. It was Marple. Her great-aunt Beatrice had known Lillian, perhaps aided her escape. The lyre's secrets were her family's too. She said nothing, tucking the ledger into her bag. The village would heal, but the lyre's melody would linger, a reminder that even the sharpest sleuth carried shadows. As she stepped into the night, the clock tower chimed, and Miss Marple walked home, ready for the next mystery to call her name.